The morning my father finally sat down at the kitchen table and didn't get up for work, I thought he was dying. He was just sitting there, both hands wrapped around his coffee mug, staring at the window the way men stare at things they've looked at so long they no longer see them. The sun was barely up. The kitchen smelled like burnt toast and old wood, the way it always had, the way it probably always would. I was 31 years old, standing in the doorway in yesterday's clothes because I'd driven 4 hours through the night after my sister called me in a panic. "Dad hasn't moved in 2 days," she'd said. "He goes to the garage, he comes back. He won't talk to Mom. He won't talk to anyone." I watched him from the doorway for a long moment before he noticed me. When he finally looked up, something crossed his face, not surprise, not relief. Something more complicated, something that looked almost like guilt. "Marcus," he said, "just my name, nothing else." I didn't know it then, but in that moment two separate secrets were about to collide. Two plans built in silence over years were about to meet in the same room for the first time. What happened next changed everything about how I understood my father and how I understood myself. I need to tell you who I was at 31 because it matters. I was the son Raymond Whitfield had wanted, and in some ways hadn't. I'd gone to college, which he'd insisted on and saved for with the same mechanical discipline he applied to everything. I'd studied business, then gotten an MBA, then gone to work for a mid-sized logistics consulting firm in Chicago. I wore suits. I used words like optimization and scalability. I made good money and spent too much of it and lived in an apartment I couldn't quite afford. My father and I loved each other, but we didn't always understand each other. He spoke in work ethic. I spoke in strategy. He believed in showing, I believed in presenting. He thought I'd gone soft behind a desk. I thought he'd gone rigid behind a workbench. We didn't fight about it, we were too alike for direct confrontation. We just existed in parallel, occasionally colliding at holidays, both quietly convinced we knew something the other didn't. Here is what I knew that my father didn't know I knew. In the summer of 2021, I was staffed on a consulting engagement for a regional manufacturing company in Pittsburgh that was navigating a plant closure. My job was to model out the financial impact on their operations and help them design a transition plan. Standard work. I'd done it before. But this engagement was different because the plant in Pittsburgh was unionized, and the union rep, a woman named Deborah Chiles who had been in labor relations for 20 years, sat across from me in a conference room on a Wednesday afternoon and said something that stopped me cold. "You want to know what really happens to the workers?" she said. "Not the severance, not the benefits extension, not the retraining vouchers nobody uses. You want to know what actually happens to a 58-year-old man who has been running a printing press for 30 years and suddenly doesn't have a job." I said I did, she told me. I went back to my hotel room that night and I called my mother. "How close is the plant to shutting down?" I asked her. There was a pause on the other end of the line, long enough to tell me everything. "Your father's fine," she said. "Don't worry about it." "Mom." "Marcus, don't." That was all I needed. I didn't call my father. I knew enough about Raymond Whitfield to know that if I called him directly, asked him directly, he'd shut down and say nothing was wrong. He'd been answering that question the same way his entire life. "Nothing's wrong. I'm handling it." And if I pushed, he'd ice up completely and we'd lose whatever fragile ground we'd built over the last few years. So I didn't ask. I started working. I want to be honest about my motivation because it wasn't entirely pure. Yes, I wanted to protect my father, but I was also, if I'm being completely honest, trying to prove something. I was the son who'd gone off and gotten educated and built a career in the corporate world, and somewhere deep in my chest there was a version of me that wanted to bring that world home and put it to use in a way my father would have to acknowledge. I'm not proud of that, but it was there. What I built was different from what my father was building. He was working with physical infrastructure, equipment, space, clients. I was working with capital and networks. Over the following 2 years, I did this quietly on the side of my regular job. I researched small business acquisition. I talked to people in my network, former classmates, consultants, contacts, about what it took to buy an existing small printing operation rather than build from scratch. I built a financial model for a leveraged buyout of a distressed print shop. I found an SBA loan program specifically designed for employee-owned business conversions. I drafted a prospectus. Then, in the spring of 2023, I found the business. A small commercial print shop in the Cleveland suburb of Garfield Heights, owned by a man named Frank Bellotti who was 67 and had been trying to sell for 2 years without success. The equipment was aging but functional. The client base was thin but real. The location was 14 miles from my parents' house. The price was $180,000. I had $45,000 in savings. I had a solid income and strong credit. I had a business plan that, according to the SBA loan officer I'd spoken with twice, was among the more compelling she'd reviewed for a first-time buyer. My plan was to buy the shop, bring it up to operational efficiency using modern workflow systems I understood from consulting, and then, this is the part I hadn't fully figured out, somehow get my father involved without making it feel like charity, because I knew Raymond Whitfield well enough to know that accepting charity from his son would destroy something essential in him. That was my problem. That was the flaw in my plan that I hadn't yet solved when everything blew up. I had been moving toward this quietly for 2 years. I had not told my mother. I had not told Deanne. I had not told my father. And then in November of 2023, the SBA loan officer called me and said, "Marcus, we're ready to move forward if you are. The seller is ready. You need to make a decision in the next 30 days or we lose the window." I was standing in a parking garage in Chicago when she called. It was 28 degrees. I said I needed a few days. I went home that night and sat at my kitchen table, the same posture I would later realize as my father at his, and I looked at what I'd built and what I was about to do. And I called my sister Diane. Diane is 4 years younger than me and has always been the person in our family who actually communicates. She's a middle school counselor in Columbus, and she has the particular skill of making you think you're talking to a friend when you're actually in a session. I've fallen for it my entire life. "He's close to shutting down," she told me, 10 minutes into the call. "The plant. It's not official, but everyone in that building knows. Dad hasn't said a word, but Mom said he's been in the garage until midnight 3 nights a week for the past month." "What's he doing in the garage?" "Marcus, what do you think he's doing?" I was quiet for a moment, planning something. Obviously planning something. He's Dad. He plans things. He doesn't talk about them and then one day they exist. I almost told her right then. Almost. But something stopped me, a version of the same instinct my father had, the belief that you don't announce it until it's ready, which, looking back, was perhaps the most Raymond Whitfield thing I had ever done in my life. "I'm handling it," I said. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "You know," Diane said slowly, "that's exactly what Dad says." I laughed and told her I'd call her soon. I didn't tell her about the loan or the shop or any of it. What I didn't know, what I was oblivious to, was that in the same 3 months that I was trying to decide whether to pull the trigger on the acquisition, my father was running into his own wall. Meridian Print Group had announced an accelerated timeline. The plant was closing in 6 months, not 12, which meant my father's carefully staged plan, his plan to launch Meridian East Print Solutions from his severance and retirement distribution, needed to be compressed. And here was his problem. The 3 anchor clients he'd secured were ready. The equipment was ready. The storage unit full of used presses was ready. But he needed operating capital for the first 6 months of payroll, and his projections showed a gap. A gap of roughly $80,000 between what he could deploy from savings and retirement and what he needed to carry 6 employees while the revenue ramped up. He'd spent months working that number down. He'd refinanced the projections 7 times on that legal pad in the garage. He'd called Patricia Osai, his lawyer, and asked her about options. She'd mentioned the SBA. He'd started the research. He was 64 years old, never owned a business, and he was trying to apply for a small business loan for a company that had no revenue history. It was not going well. This is when Diane got scared enough to call me. She didn't know why our father was deteriorating, she just knew he was. 2 days of silence, the blank stare, the hands around the coffee mug. And I drove 4 hours through the night and stood in the kitchen doorway looking at my father, and neither of us knew that we had been building toward the same thing for years, without saying a word to each other. The person who blew everything open was Patricia Ose. I want to be clear. She didn't do it out of malice or carelessness. She did it because she had no idea there was a secret to protect, because my father had never told her about me, and I had never told anyone about him. Here is how it happened. 3 days after I arrived at my parents' house, I drove to the Cleveland SBA office to have an in-person meeting with the loan officer I'd been working with, a methodical woman named Sandra Trout who preferred face-to-face when a deal was close to closing. I wanted to firm up the timeline and ask one more question about the seller's terms. I was in the meeting for 40 minutes. When I came out, there were 2 voicemails on my phone. The first was from Diane, "Call me immediately, something's happening." The second was from a number I didn't recognize, and when I listened to it I heard a woman's voice, professional and slightly cautious, saying, "Mr. Whitfield, this is Patricia Osei. I'm the attorney working with your father on Meridian East Print Solutions. I believe there may be a conflict I need to make you aware of. I got your name from Sandra Trout's office. Apparently you're working with the same loan officer on a connected file. Please call me when you can." I stood in the parking lot of the SBA office for a full minute without moving. Then I called Diane back. "Dad's business attorney called here," Diane said, and her voice had that particular quality it gets when she's trying to hold 2 very large feelings at once. "She was looking for you. Something about a loan and a business." "Marcus, what is going on? How much do you know about what Dad has been building?" I asked. "What do you mean, building?" "In the garage, for the last 8 years. A silence. "Marcus," she said, "what has he been building?" "Call him," I said. "Tell him I'm coming home and we need to sit down, all of us, tonight." "Should I tell him why?" I thought about it. Tell him Patricia Osei called me. Another silence, longer. "Oh," Diane said quietly. "Oh, this is going to be something." I drove back to my parents' house. I sat in the car in the driveway for 10 minutes. Inside the house, through the front window, I could see the kitchen light on. I could see my mother moving around the room. I could see my father sitting at the table again, same posture, same coffee mug. Except now Diane was sitting across from him and they were clearly in the middle of a conversation that had already changed the temperature of the room. I got out of the car. I went inside. My mother looked at me when I came through the door and her face went through 3 different expressions in 2 seconds. Surprise, understanding, and then something I can only describe as exhausted relief. The look of a woman who had been living inside other people's silence for a very long time and was finally watching it crack. "Marcus," she said, "sit down." My father looked up. He looked at me the same way he'd looked at me that first morning, complicated, guarded, something underneath it that I couldn't yet read. Diane was watching both of us like a scientist who has just realized 2 experiments have been running in the same lab. I sat down. No one spoke for a moment. The kitchen clock ticked. Outside, a car went past on the street. My father spoke first. "Patricia called you." "This afternoon," I said, "from Sandra Trout's office." My father's jaw moved slightly. "Sandra Trout is the SBA loan officer." "I know," I said. "She's been my loan officer for the past 8 months." The shift in my father's expression was slow and seismic, like watching a continent move. "What are you saying?" I took a breath. I looked at Diane, who gave me nothing, just that counselor's face, open and waiting. I looked at my mother, who was standing against the counter with her arms crossed, not in anger but in the posture of someone bracing for something they've been waiting to hear. "I found a print shop," I said, "in Garfield Heights. Owner's been trying to sell for 2 years. The price is workable, The client base is thin but real, and I've been building a business plan around it for the better part of 2 years. SBA loan, partial acquisition. I was going to modernize the operations, bring in digital workflow systems, and I stopped. I was going to bring it to you. I hadn't figured out how yet. How to make it feel like a partnership instead of a handout, my father said. His voice was flat, not angry, flat in the way it gets when he's working something through. Yes, I said. He looked at me for a long moment, then he said, how much? The acquisition, $180,000. I have $45,000. The SBA covers the rest if my plan clears underwriting. Client base. Thin, 3 small commercial accounts and some walk-in retail, which is why the price is low. He nodded once slowly, like he was receiving data. Dad, I said, what is Meridian East Print Solutions? The silence that followed lasted maybe 5 seconds. In terms of emotional weight, it lasted about 3 years. My father set down his coffee mug. He straightened in his chair. And then, for the first time in the entire conversation, he looked directly at me without guardedness. Just looked at me, steady and direct, the way he'd looked at machines he was about to break down and understand. 8 years ago, he said, I watched the plant start dying and I decided I wasn't going to let it take my crew with it. And then he told us. He told us all of it, the legal pad, the business courses, the storage unit in the east side, the used equipment, the 3 anchor clients, Patricia Osai, the financial projections he'd run 40 times over 8 years, adjusting and readjusting, cutting costs, finding efficiencies, modeling for every scenario he could imagine. Diane had her hand over her mouth before he was halfway through. My mother, and this is the part that gets me the most, my mother was not surprised. She stood against the counter with that same braced posture, and she listened to her husband describe 8 years of secret plans, and her eyes were wet but her expression was something that I can only call recognized. She had known, not the details, but she had known there was a plan, because Raymond Whitfield was always planning something, and she had learned over 40 years to trust his process even in the dark. The equipment is already acquired, he said. The clients are in place. Patricia has the paperwork ready. What I needed, what I couldn't close, was the operating capital for the first 6 months of payroll. He paused. I came up short by about 80,000. I looked at him. My chest had gone very tight. Dad, I said, my acquisition target in Garfield Heights. It has an existing equipment infrastructure. Aging but operational. It has 3 client accounts I was planning to build from. I heard you, he said. Your crew, I said slowly. How many? 6 to start. I wanted to bring on everyone I could. I looked at the table. My mind was doing the thing it does when it's running numbers I already know the answer to. That's the team to operate the shop, the Garfield Heights shop. If we're not starting from scratch, if we're acquiring something that already has a physical location, existing accounts, established vendor relationships, then your operating capital gap changes completely. You don't need $80,000 to float the first 6 months. You need 30, my father said. We looked at each other. 30, I confirmed. The silence that followed was different from the earlier silences. It wasn't the silence of withheld information. It was the silence of 2 people standing on opposite sides of a bridge, realizing they'd each been building toward the middle. Diane made a sound, half laugh, half something that wanted to be a cry. You were both, she stopped, tried again. You were both doing the same thing. We were building different pieces, I said. Of the same plan, my father said. My mother unfolded her arms. She sat down at the table, the thing she never does in the middle of a conversation. She always stands, always positioned to move, always ready for the next thing to need doing. She sat down. She put her hands flat on the table, and she looked at her husband and then at her son, and she said quietly, "Neither of you told me." I didn't want to worry you, my father said. I didn't want to get your hopes up, I said almost simultaneously. My mother looked at us both for a moment. Then she said, "You are the most exhausting people I have ever met." My father stood up. He was a man who thought on his feet. The garage was proof of that, but so was 30 years of managing a production floor where things went wrong in real time and someone had to move. He walked to the window, looked out at the driveway, and I watched his shoulders adjust, not relax exactly, but reset, the way they do when he's finished calculating and has arrived somewhere. "Walk me through your acquisition model," he said without turning around. "Right now." "You drove 4 hours. You didn't drive 4 hours to not talk about it." I looked at Diane. She raised her eyebrows. "Don't look at me." I pulled out my phone. I had the financial model saved as a PDF. I always had it with me, the way some people carry photos in their wallet. I set it on the table. My father turned from the window, walked back, and sat down across from me. For the next hour we went through it together. He asked questions that showed 8 years of his own study. He understood amortization schedules. He understood equipment depreciation. He understood the difference between gross revenue and operating margin in a way that most people who haven't run a business don't. He pushed back twice on my projections, and both times he was right. I had underestimated equipment maintenance costs, and I had been too optimistic about the timeline for converting the existing walk-in retail base into recurring commercial accounts. I pushed back on his client projections, and was also right. His 3 anchor clients were conservative but solid, and he'd left money on the table by not pricing the church consortium contract at market rate. We were arguing, I realized at some point, but the good kind. The kind where both people are trying to find the same thing. My mother made sandwiches. Diane took notes on her phone. At some point close to midnight, my father leaned back in his chair and looked at the papers spread between us, and he was quiet for a while. Then he said, "Meridian East Print Solutions. That's the name I filed." "It's a good name," I said. "It was a bridge," he said, "between where we were and where we needed to go." I nodded. "We could keep it," I said carefully. "Or we could file a DBA, a doing business as, under the acquisition entity. Technically cleaner if we're buying an existing operation. Patricia would know." "I'll call Patricia tomorrow," he said. He'd said we. It was Diane who said it out loud. She always says it out loud, the thing that everyone else is feeling but has encased in practicality to avoid being overwhelmed by it. "Do you understand what this is?" She said, looking at both of us. "Dad, you built the team and the infrastructure and the client base to run a print shop. Marcus, you found the physical business, the space, the acquisition structure, the financing. You each built the part the other was missing. You each thought you were doing it alone." She looked at my father. "You thought you were protecting your crew and you didn't want anyone to talk you out of it." She looked at me. "You thought you were protecting him and you didn't want it to feel like charity." She looked between us. "Neither of you told each other, and somehow you both ended up needing the exact thing the other one had." My father looked at me across the table, and I looked at him. We were not a hugging family. We were not a "let me tell you how I feel" family. We were a Raymond Whitfield family, which meant we expressed things through action and logistics and the language of work. I had spent 31 years learning that language and resenting it sometimes and respecting it always. But when my father said what he said next, even the logistics couldn't hold it. "I thought you'd think less of me," he said, very quietly. "If I came to you with a plan that hadn't worked, if I came to you and said I built this thing and I'm $80,000 short and I can't close it, I thought—" He stopped, cleared his throat. "I thought you'd look at me and see a 64-year-old man who bit off more than he could chew." "Dad, I know how you look at things, Marcus. You're precise. You analyze, you see the gaps." "I wasn't analyzing you. I know that now. I was trying to build something for you," I said. Because I sat in a conference room in Pittsburgh watching what happens to men your age when the plant closes and comes home and thought, not him, not my dad. That is the only reason I did any of this. He looked at me for a long time. "I know," he said again. And then Raymond Earl Whitfield, the man who had communicated exclusively in work plans and boot leather and packed lunches for 30 years. He put his hand on my arm across the table. just for a moment. Firm and brief the way he did things, but it was there. We were both trying to do the same thing, he said. We just didn't know the other one was doing it. Diane made that sound again. My mother, who had been quiet for a long time, reached across and put her hand over both of ours. The kitchen clock ticked. Outside, Cleveland was doing whatever Cleveland does at midnight in winter, and the four of us sat at the kitchen table under the same light we'd sat under my whole life, and something shifted in the room, the way temperature changes when a window opens, gradual and total. The next morning, we had the real conversation, not the emotional one that had happened. This was the professional one, and in some ways it was harder because it required both of us to set down the tools we were most comfortable with and pick up the ones we were least sure about. My father's approach was the emotional solution. It had always been. Build something real in the physical world with your hands and your knowledge for people you're responsible to. His crew, his legacy. His name on a business that meant something concrete and immediate to 6 families who were about to lose their income. My approach was the smart solution: structure, capital, acquisition, systems. Build something that was financially defensible, professionally organized and scalable, something that wasn't dependent on the owner working himself into the ground the way his father had. Here's what we realized we needed: both. His approach without mine was undercapitalized and operationally thin. My approach without his was technically sound but hollow. I could have bought that shop in Garfield Heights and modernized it, and it would have been a perfectly adequate small business with no soul, no crew loyalty, no 30 years of accumulated knowledge in its walls. Together, though. You run operations, I said. You know how to run a floor. You know the equipment, you know how to manage a crew, you know the clients and how to keep them. That's not learnable from a spreadsheet. You handle the business structure, he said. It wasn't a question, but it held a question inside it, whether he could accept this, whether he could be the operational half of a company where his son held the equity architecture. I thought carefully about what to say. Here's what I want to propose, I said. We co-found it, 50-50. My name on the SBA loan because my credit profile makes the underwriting cleaner. Your name as operating partner with full decision authority on the floor. Patricia structures the partnership agreement so neither of us can move without the other on major decisions, but day-to-day operations are yours. You hire your crew. You set the floor culture. I build the financial infrastructure and handle client development. He was quiet for a while. I don't want it to look like you bailaid me out, he said. Then we make sure it doesn't, I said. You brought 8 years of work to this table: equipment, clients, legal structure, operational knowledge, a crew ready to be hired. You didn't come with nothing. You came with everything except the acquisition vehicle. That's what I brought. This isn't a bailout. This is a merger. He looked at that word for a moment. Merger. It was the right word, and I think we both felt it land. My mother, who had been listening from the doorway with a cup of coffee, said quietly, "Raymond, let your son help you." He looked at her. Something in him adjusted the final calculation, the last line on the legal pad. "All right," he said. The closing happened on February 14th, Valentine's Day, which my mother pointed out with precisely the amount of sentiment my father could tolerate, which is to say she mentioned it once and let it be what it was. Frank Bellotti, the previous owner, walked us through the shop before he handed over the keys. It was a weekday morning, winter light coming through the industrial windows, the smell of ink and paper and machine oil that my father had lived inside for 30 years. I watched him walk the floor, watched his hands go to the equipment the way hands go to things they understand, and I saw the shift in him that I had never seen in the kitchen or the garage or any of the planning sessions. He was in his element. He was exactly where he was supposed to be. Patricia Ose handled the partnership documentation. Sandra Trout's SBA loan closed 11 days before my credit. His operational plan, the combined asset base, and the anchor client contracts he'd spent years securing all contributed to an approval that Sandra told me afterward had been among the cleaner files she'd processed all year. My father called his crew on a Sunday night, one by one, 6 calls. I listened from the next room while he told them, not with sentimentality, not with speeches, but in the practical, direct language of a man offering a concrete thing to people who needed concrete things. "Shop opens March 3rd, he said, on every call. "If you want in, I need you Monday morning at 7. All 6 came. The day the shop opened, I drove in from Chicago. My mother and Diane came with flowers, which my father accepted with the embarrassed tolerance of a man who has never known what to do with flowers. I stood in the doorway of Meridian East Print Solutions, the Garfield Heights location, the blue and white sign above the entrance, the equipment humming behind the front counter, and I watched Raymond Whitfield walk the floor the way I'd watched him in the garage my whole life. He stopped at the main press, ran his hand along the housing, checked the paper feed alignment with the same automatic attention he gave every machine he'd ever been responsible for. One of his crew, a man named Gerald who had worked beside my father for 14 years, came up and said something I couldn't hear. My father said something back. Gerald laughed, the real kind, and went back to the press. My father turned and saw me watching. He crossed the floor. He stopped in front of me. He was wearing the same brand of work boots he'd always worn. He looked like himself, completely and entirely, in a way I realized he hadn't looked in months. "You should come by more often," he said. "I'm 3 hours away. I know how far you are." It was an invitation from Raymond Whitfield, delivered in Raymond Whitfield's language, which means you had to know him to understand that you should come by more often meant I want you here. I'm proud you're in this with me. I couldn't have done it without you, and I can't quite say that yet, but I mean to. I said, "I'll be here the first Monday of every month to go over the books." He nodded, "Fine." "And Dad?" "What?" "You built something real," I said. 8 years of work in that garage. That wasn't nothing. That was most of it. He was quiet for a moment. "You saw the gap I missed," he said finally. "You built the thing worth saving," I said. He looked at me. Then he looked around the shop, at his crew, at the machines, at the morning light coming through the industrial windows, at the small sign above the door that bore the name he'd filed in 2017, the name that had waited in a legal document for 8 years to mean something. "We both did," he said. Meridian East Print Solutions hit its first-year revenue target in 11 months. They brought on a 7th employee in October, 2 more anchor clients in December. My father runs the floor at 64 years old with the same energy and precision he'd given the plant for 3 decades, except now it belongs to him, to us. Patricia Osei still handles the legal work. Sandra Trout sent a congratulations card when we cleared our first SBA milestone payment. My mother comes in on Friday afternoons. She says she's just visiting. She has, in fact, reorganized the front office twice, redesigned the client intake form, and implemented a scheduling system that cut turnaround time by 30%. My father pretends to be annoyed. He is not annoyed. Diane drove up in September and spent a weekend helping us work through a conflict between 2 of the crew members. She billed us nothing, which meant she felt like family, because that's what family does. It shows up with exactly the skill you need, when you need it, without being asked. I come on the first Monday of every month. I go over the books with my father at the work table near the back of the shop, the same way he once sat at a garage workbench with a legal pad, building something no one could see yet. We argue about projections. We agree on most things. We disagree on some things, and we handle it the way the partnership agreement says we should, which Patricia designed specifically for 2 men who are too similar to fight openly and too different to always agree. Here is what I know now that I didn't know the night I drove 4 hours in the dark and stood in the kitchen doorway looking at my father. Silence is not the same as absence. A man who doesn't talk about his plan is not a man without a plan. And sometimes the most powerful thing a son can do is not arrive with answers, but arrive at exactly the right moment, carrying exactly the piece that was missing, and be humble enough to recognize that the piece he was carrying was not the whole thing. My father worked in silence for 8 years because that's how he built things. That's how Raymond Whitfield has always built things, quietly, carefully, without announcement, trusting the process even when no one else could see it yet. I showed up overnight with a financial model and a deed of sale and called it saving him. But what I actually did was meet him in the middle. And that's where we are now. In the middle, building something together in the language we finally both speak, half logic, half love, entirely ours. The morning after the opening, I found a note on my car windshield. My father's neat block print on a piece of paper torn from a yellow legal pad. It said, "Good work. From Raymond Earl Whitfield." That is a sonnet. If this story hit something real for you, something about the way the people you love build things in silence, or the way the most important plans are the ones nobody announces, share it with someone who needs to hear it. We all have someone like Raymond in our lives, and most of us have a little Raymond in ourselves. Subscribe. Leave a comment. Tell me who you thought of while you were watching this. I'll see you in the next one.